And having adopted more of that as kind of my core identity over time has really created this space for me to just try things and to do things that feel kind of scary, even though I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but to know that I can figure out my way through it. So yeah, that big identity shift of leaving the military has certainly influenced everything that's happened since.
How can you create a career that's aligned with your values and fulfills you on as many levels as possible while creating more peace and less angst in your life overall? Let's talk all about it with leadership, career, and professional development coach Karen Steinbock right here on episode 499 of The Nurse Keith Show. Hey there, this is Nurse Keith. This podcast is about you and your personal professional development, your career, and the healthcare system writ large. And I'm here to share education ideas and informative interviews with some of the most inspiring people from the worlds of healthcare, nursing, entrepreneurship, and beyond. I love having you along for the ride, and I thank you from the bottom of my nurse podcaster's heart for being part of the growing Nurse Keith Nation, especially now that we're right on the cusp of episode 500. If you'd like to help other people find the show, you can leave a rating and review, of course, over on Apple Podcasts. Become a patron at patreon.com/Nurse Keith. That's patreon.com/Nurse Keith, or just share the show with anyone you think might enjoy it or get something out of it. And no matter how you're interacting with us and with the show, I appreciate anything you'd like to do, including just being here listening right now. The show notes can be found on nursekeith.com, where it says podcast in the drop-down menu. And you can always find the links and everything we mention right in the app where you happen to find yourself listening on your smartphone or other device. And as I said, we're here today with my new friend and colleague, Karen Steinbock. And Karen is a leadership, career, and professional development coach whose work is greatly aligned with what I do. And Karen, I'm so happy to have you here. I'm so glad we met on LinkedIn, which was very serendipitous. And I wanted to ask you this first question, which is sort of a big one, which is, how did you decide that creating more peace and less angst in your life and the life of the people you work with was really central to what you felt like we really need around our careers?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here, Keith. It's lovely to get to sit down and chat with you today. I think realizing that so many people I know and I've met, and even in my own experience, we end up in this place where it kind of feels like we're forcing our way through our career. You know, we're getting up, we've got the grind going, and we're trying to make it work, but it just doesn't really feel quite right and quite aligned with who we are and maybe who we want to be. And digging into our values and getting really clear on the type of life we want to create and the type of career we want to have and how we want that to fit into our life, not necessarily just be the thing we have to do in order to live the rest of our lives, but really have it be aligned with the life that we want to create, just brings more enjoyment and more calmness to our world when we can create that. And look, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do of like just deciding, oh, I just want to have more peace in my career. But there are ways to get at it, and there are ways to really start to experiment with and investigate like how we can create that more effectively for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And we choose careers for different reasons, right? Like sometimes it might be a family legacy. You know, you might come from a family of nurses, so that's what kind of leads you into nursing. You know, sometimes it's just serendipity or circumstance that leads you into a particular career path. Sometimes it's just you kind of fall into something without even knowing why or how. It just sort of happens. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I am a blank, you know, whatever you want to fill that blank in with. So when we have the ability, I guess we always have the ability, but when we're faced with the choice of choosing a career path, right? Like with consciousness, like we were like, okay, I'm going to go after this. And I guess a lot of us do that, right? We choose school or whatever. So when you're in the midst of trying to choose what that is, what are some of the things you've found in your work and in your life yourself that are sort of the signposts along the way that you're heading in the right direction?
As you said, we often make choices in our careers. We often do it at a very young age where we haven't had a lot of experience in the world. And it could be influence from our families, it could be influence from society on what a quote unquote good job is. It could be we just think this might be something we like. And I think in the initial choosing of a career, there's kind of a little trial and error to it. We don't often have enough life experience yet to really know if this is going to be a right fit for me or not. And I think that's a really important part of the career process is there is some learning. One of my favorite quotes is that clarity comes through action. And we can think about things all we want and we can contemplate the right path, but ultimately it's not until we start trying things, it's not until we start taking action that we start to get additional clarity on what we like and don't like and what fits for us and what doesn't. And so when I think of people a little further along in their careers, perhaps, or having had a job or two out of school, and they're trying to think about what they want to do, signposts I look at is does this feel aligned with the actual life I want to create? Like I so often, you probably run into this in career coaching as well. People that we're working with are looking at jobs that don't align with what they say they want. I want to be home with my family, but they're looking at jobs that are going to have a 2 hour commute and they're going to have really long work days. Or I really want to be doing something creative, but they're looking at jobs that are super structured and aren't going to necessarily offer the space for that creativity that they say they want. So one of the signposts is certainly looking for where is that alignment? Is that happening? Is this actual thing I'm applying to and looking for in alignment with what I believe that I want? Also, from a values standpoint of who you are as a person, right? So if what's really important to you is a lot of work around like equity and justice, there are jobs that are going to support that mission for you, and there are jobs that aren't. And if you're working in a space or applying to spaces that aren't going to support your values, that's going to be a really high conflict place for you to work, conflict internally, at least. So looking at that alignment between the goals we actually want in our life and the values that we have is probably one of the biggest signposts. And also, I think it can be helpful to apply to things and then see how you feel about it afterwards. It's so
Mm-hmm.
funny how I've had this experience myself where like I've applied to something and then afterwards I was like, ooh, I don't actually think I want to do that. But the process of doing it sort of helped me to process that. Or I've had the experience of getting a rejection from an application and feeling a little bit of relief and being like, huh, that's a really interesting thing to notice. So those are, I think, a couple of the things. Certainly we could get into more, but I think a couple of the things that rise to the top for me.
Those sound really salient, around values and around seeing if it's really a fit. And, it's kind of like I talk to a lot of people who want to be nurse practitioners, right? They're nurses who want to transition to advanced practice. And so many choose the FNP route, family nurse
Mhm.
practitioner, right? And and then what I find is a lot of them feel really unhappy with that choice. And part of it is, I'll often ask people who are looking at FNP, I'll be like, so do you really want to work with people across the whole lifespan? Like, do you want to study everything from infancy through advanced age? And they'll be like, no, I don't want to work with kids at all.
Mhm.
Like, I only want to work with people over 18. And I'm like, well, then maybe adult Jerry might be the right choice because you don't even want to work with children, or it's like that's just not your place. So I feel like with the FNP and the nurse practitioner world, it just feels like there's just I don't know. There's just everybody's like all about FNP for some reason. It's like everyone and their mother wants to be an FNP. And I'm like, why is that? And there's also this question that you brought up with me prior to this recording was this whole like generalist versus specialist, because obviously you can choose a highly specialized area to go into. And then there's also the generalist roles, whether you're in nursing or not, it doesn't even matter if it's in the medical and healthcare world. So, what have you discovered yourself, like in your own life and working with clients in career coaching around the whole specialist generalist paradigm? And how do you find out what suits you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, I would love to comment on your F&P route thing.
Yeah.
I find a lot of people are looking at higher education, whether it be F&P or something else, or even a job shift or a career or industry shift, but they know very little about the thing they think they want to do. They just
Mm-hmm.
think they might want to do it. And yet here they are about to go back to graduate school or invest a huge amount of time, money, energy
Mm-hmm.
into something. And so one of the things I consistently advise my coaches to do is like, hey, get on LinkedIn. If you don't know people who do this job, if you know people who do this job, that's great. Interview them, talk to them. When you're clear on your values and what you want, you can then frame questions in ways that help you understand if that role actually is aligned with the type of work and the type of life you want to have. And if you don't know people, I've explored different industries before. I've reached out to people on LinkedIn who do that job and I say, hey, I'm exploring this as a potential career move. Would you be willing to have a 15 to 20-minute conversation with me? And people are often very willing to do that.
They are.
So the minimal upfront investment of time of kind of asking questions and learning more about roles before committing a huge amount of time and energy and money to pursuing them can be a really, really valuable path to take.
It is, yeah, the whole like informational interview thing, whether it's formal or informal, like if you're just asking somebody, like you and I met on LinkedIn. I think you commented on something I posted and then I wrote you back and then we messaged back and forth and then we hopped on Zoom and had a conversation and then I invited you to be on the podcast. It's like there's it's not that hard to connect with somebody in a space like LinkedIn. So do you find that people get a lot of bang for their buck when it comes to that little investment of time and energy?
I think so. I
Mm-hmm.
think when you take the time to prepare up front and
Mm-hmm.
get really clear on what you're looking for so that you can frame those questions in a way that helps you get that information. If you're just meeting with people and being like, how do you like being a nurse practitioner? Like that might not get you the value from that experience. But if you have really clear questions that are framed around trying to identify if this type of work is in alignment for you, I think it can be a really powerful investment of time.
Mm-hmm.
And to get to your generalist versus specialist, this is such a cool thing. I wanted to be an ER nurse. Like that was the only thing I wanted to do in college. I worked in an ER while I was doing nursing school. I wanted to become an ER nurse. I became an ER nurse and after a number of years kind of came to the discovery that I didn't really want to be an ER nurse anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I had always planned on specializing, like that was my plan. But when that became not really aligned anymore with what I wanted or what I was looking for, and I started shifting and doing other work, what I've learned over time is I'm very much more wired to be a generalist. Like I love learning a lot of things about a lot of things. And then I really enjoy the process of taking that information from, disparate areas or maybe even related areas and seeing how I can repackage it in a way that adds value to myself, to the people I work with, and to the organizations I work for that has some unique perspectives, perhaps, that like a specialist who's been doing the same work for a very long time might not have. And we need both, right? We need people who specialize, absolutely. And we need generalists who can bring fresh perspective or maybe infuse different ideas from kind of different areas of the world into our processes to help us continue to improve. As far as figuring out which you are, it's a little bit of trial and error. I mean, some people are definitely more wired to be specialists. They would rather go really deep on their topic. And some people are a little more wired like me. I think it's kind of a spectrum too. It's like a continuum, it's not like you're one or the other. But some people are more at the edge of the continuum of wanting to do a number of different things and then combine that in a unique way to add value. So I
Mhm.
don't know, like there's not one way like to, oh, here's how you can tell, but there's certainly in evaluating what brings you joy in your work and where you get excited and where you have focus and where you're drawn to, spending some time self-reflecting or in a coaching space, evaluating those things can really help kind of point to perhaps which where you fall in that on that spectrum.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. And it's sometimes it's just hard to know. And you do need to talk to people and you need to kind of feel out what it is you want and what what kind of how you operate. What's your modus operandi. And recently my wife and I were in Greece and I was reading a lot about ancient Greece, and I read a book about Socrates recently that someone I met had written, and it made me start to think about the really old process and culture of apprenticeship. You
Mm,
mentioned about 10 minutes ago, you mentioned the whole notion of like when you're really young, you have to choose what you want to be. And And when we choose what we want to be now in the 21st century, it means like generally going to college and investing 4 years or more and a lot of money on a
absolutely.
lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get there. And then maybe realizing that that wasn't what you wanted. That happened to me. I went to art school and I dropped out of two different art schools, and I had to flounder for, gosh, my entire 20s till I became a nurse at 32. So, you know, not everybody finds that straight and narrow path. Some people do. My brother became a scientist and went on and got his master's, then his PhD, and now he works at Harvard. It's like he had that trajectory. That doesn't happen with everybody, I find. There's a lot of peregrinations for a lot of people.
Mhm.
So I know that you were in the Navy at one point, I think early in your life, and you had to figure out how to transition out of that. So, what was that about? And how did that story and that experience how did that shape what you chose to do next? Like, how did you make those transitions in your life?
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that question. That's a fun one to think about.
Sure.
I did. I started my nursing career in the Navy. I went to school on a Navy nursing scholarship, and about a year before I graduated, 9/11 happened. So kind of everything shifted in my world of the world I was expecting. I mean, everything shifted in many people's worlds, right? But
Mm-hmm.
for someone who was committed to the military already and about to finish nursing school, I knew that the career I was about to enter was not the one I was anticipating entering when I initially signed up. And that proved to be true. I spent about a year on med surg, and then I deployed to Iraq with a surgical company, so sort of like a modern day MASH, if you will. And we spent 7 months there doing combat trauma work, um, and with an amazing, such an incredible team of people. And then came back and worked in the ER for few years, and then I did hit that point where I had the option to get out of the Navy or stay. And I had always planned, at that point I was 27, I had planned on making the Navy my career. Like I didn't have a backup plan. Navy nursing was plans A through Z.
Mm-hmm.
And I had reached this point though where it just didn't feel like the right place for me anymore. It didn't feel aligned. Like in my core person, I knew I needed to make a change. And it was extremely terrifying because here I was like in my late 20s, and that was the only thing I had worked on. Like that was the identity I had built for myself. That was the career I had built for myself. And the thought of stepping away to something new was super terrifying. And I didn't even know what I wanted to step away to, which makes it even scarier, right? When you don't even know what you want to move to. Um, and so I found myself in this kind of career crisis, but also in this identity crisis because I'd really built my identity as a Navy ER nurse. Like that's who I am, that's what I do. And when I can look back on my career and into the different moments, I see that as a defining moment in my career and in my life where I was super scared, but I did the thing that felt right to me anyway. Like I kind of pushed through that fear and made the choice that I knew was the right choice. And that I think has shifted everything for me since. That ability to do a scary thing and come out the other side of it while acting in alignment with what felt true and right to me was such a really just profoundly positive experience. And it began to shift my identity from the work I do. Like, oh, I'm a nurse who works in the Navy and I'm an ER nurse, I'm a trauma nurse. And it began to shift my identity from that to like, oh, I'm a person who can do scary things. Like I'm a person who can navigate challenging situations and uncertain risks, and I can figure out how to get through that to the other side. And having adopted more of that as kind of my core identity over time has really created this space for me to just try things and to do things that feel kind of scary, even though I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but to
Mm.
know that I can figure out my way through it. So yeah, that big identity shift of leaving the military has certainly influenced everything that's happened since.
Wow. Okay. That's big. And, you know, I think you're hitting on something so important that of I that notion of identity and how big that is in our culture and a lot of other
Mm-hmm.
societies too. That whole thing of you meet someone at a party and the first thing you ask them is what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that's what a lot of our self definition comes from is what do you do for a living? Right? That's just like sure, it's a way to break the ice, but I think it's more than that. I think that belies what it is that a lot of us hold as the most important thing in our life, right? We don't ask someone, when you meet someone at a party, you don't generally ask them, other questions. It's always kind of goes to what do you do? And that way in which our culture defines us and we define ourselves can be really limiting. But it also is part of how we move in the world. Like, I'm a nurse. Like, nursing tends to be quite an identity for people, most people. It's not just a job. So, when we come back from the break, I want to talk more about career transitions. I want to touch on leadership and some other things that you and I have already chatted about. So we're going to come back and kind of dive right back in. So hang in there with us and we'll be right back for the second half of episode 499 of the Nurse Keith Show. And we are with Karen Steinbock, and she is a professional development, leadership, and career coach extraordinaire. We'll be right back. Hey everyone, let's take a quick pause for the cause, shall we? Thanks for being a valued listener of the Nurse Keith Show. And if you'd like to help other people find the podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This really helps propel the show and grow our audience. And I truly appreciate everyone who's already taken the time. And if leaving a public rating review isn't your thing, why not tell a colleague about the Nurse Keith Show by sending them a link so they can listen for themselves? After all, word of mouth is the most organic way for me to reach those who truly need to tune in. So if you'd like to do me a solid, please consider leaving a rating review or telling a friend or colleague. And by doing so, you'll be helping the Nurse Keith Show reach more and more nurses and healthcare professionals all around the world. Now, let's get back to today's conversation. And welcome back to the second half of the episode. We're here again with friend of the pod and my new friend and colleague, Karen Steinbock. And Karen is a leadership, career, and professional development coach. And Karen, you and I met on LinkedIn, like I mentioned, which is really awesome. And I've met so many amazing people through LinkedIn. Back in the day, I would meet people on Twitter. Like that was where I hung out maybe 10, 12, 14 years ago. That's where I met a lot of people. But LinkedIn's kind of become more of that's kind of the place where I hang out and meet people. And when, when you are out in the world, whether you're on LinkedIn or you're meeting people in person, you know, what do you hear from people in general about their careers and where they are and where they want to be? And like, do you find that people find their happiness generally through their careers? Do you meet a lot of people who seem to kind of, they take their career in stride and, their kids and their families are more important to them? Like, where do a lot of people fall on that continuum between, career being everything and then career being just like a job? Like, where do a lot of people fall?
Sure. I I think there's kind of a blend. I like that you talk about it as a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly know a very few people, like very few individuals who are super content in the work that they do. They don't find it necessarily very exciting and they're not in a growth space, but their work is good enough. Like they are happy there and content with where they're at, and it supports the rest of their life. And
Mm-hmm.
that works for them. And they are genuinely content. They're not just settling with this like mild dissatisfaction. It just is a thing that they're happy with. And I think that's the expectation that's given to many of us when we're younger and we enter the workforce of like it's either that expectation like yeah, you'll just find a thing, it'll be great, it'll support the rest of your life and you'll totally be happy with that, or the expectation of like, well, work is a drag and you just have to suck it up and deal with it because it's part of being a human and an adult
Mm-hmm.
in the world, right? I think we kind of those are narratives that people are frequently fed.
True.
And I think that more people are in the space, at least more of the people I meet and engage with are in the space of just this mild unsettledness. I don't know if that's a word. Unsettledness, this mild dissatisfaction of with where they're at in their careers. And, some people are certainly at the extreme of they're just kind of in pain and suffering with where they're at and they feel really stuck and they feel really trapped and those that is something that has an urgency of need to change. But I think there's still a lot of people in the middle who are just like, meh, I don't really like it. Um, and yet here I am. And making a change can feel a lot of times harder and scarier than staying in a place that's very mediocre. Mediocre,
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know where I've heard this, but like mediocrity kills more dreams, than just about anything else. Because in mediocrity, it's really hard for us to take action. It's pretty easy to take action when we're in extreme suffering. So I think that is the space that a lot of people that we find ourselves in from time to time is that space of wishing for more and wishing for something that feels more aligned and more fulfilling and more aligned in more, yeah, in alignment with what we want in our lives. And yet kind of it's not that terrible. Maybe I should just be happy with it. Kind of in that general space.
Mm-hmm. So when you work with people who are in that place of, they want to transition, they know that like they want something, like they just know where they are is like just it's either not comfortable or they're super unhappy or it's just kind of mediocre, like you were saying. So what are the things that you like to help people look at so that they can start to move in a direction that feels good? Like, do they, are there big overarching questions that you encourage your clients to ask, or are there little like pieces of minutia that they need to examine? Like, where do you start? Like, what are some of the mechanisms for making that transition?
Sure. Yeah, we tend to start in a place of getting really clear on values.
Okay.
I think we all think, on the surface level, we can maybe rattle off what we say our values are, but really spending some time exploring that. What does that mean? How is that showing up in your work the way that it currently is? How is it not showing up? Where has it shown up in the past? I love looking at things in the past in terms of what we can learn from them. So have I had opportunities in the past where I felt really engaged and really excited about the work that I was doing? And if so, what did that look like? And what's different from that to where what I'm experiencing now?
Hmm.
And it's interesting because sometimes I think when people are in that space, they think they're looking for a job transition, but what they're really looking for is more alignment. And sometimes that can be created in the job that they're in. And I don't step into a coaching space saying like, "Oh, I'm going to help this person change their job." My stepping into that space is to say, "Hey, we're going to explore what you're actually needing and wanting in your world, and then look at the possibilities for creating that." And it's interesting to me how often people are actually in a job they like with people they like, but they're not necessarily doing the work that they want to do. And doing work around how can you have a conversation with your supervisor or boss about infusing more of this into your work, or how might you shift your work, or how might you advocate, can actually have a really positive impact on someone in their current work without having to change jobs. So it's really spending time to get clear on kind of what the pain points are. What do you want to be different? Like, how do you want it to look instead? When have you experienced that in the past? So questions digging into values, digging into how that is or isn't being manifested currently. And I love appreciative coaching too, looking at things that you've done well, things that add joy to your world in the past, and how we can pull from that coming forward and then decide what that needs to look like. Like, does that need to look like a job change? Does that need to look like attempting to implement that where you're at? Or does it need to look some other different way?
Hmm. That's great. Values is a place I often start to. And I often point people to the Barrett Values Center. I don't know if you're aware of Barrett. I think it's Barret, or it might be double T. And it's the Barrett's Values Center. And on their website, you can do a values evaluation. And I think it's like $15 or something. And they send you this really cool report. And I found it pretty helpful. And there's, I know you also have a free download, and we're going to have a link in the show notes about it's a download about career transition. And I know part of that download, which I downloaded myself, is about evaluating your values. So people will find that link in the show notes if they want to download that. And then they can connect with you, which I think is really awesome. So that'll be in the
Thanks.
show notes. Yeah. Um, so, gosh, I mean, you're right. There's values are important, and you and I mentioned earlier in the show around like you value being with your kids, but you're commuting 4 hours a day, and you're not home till 8:30, right? And your kids are going to bed by the time you get home. Or someone chooses a career path where they love to travel, but their career doesn't allow them to travel at all, right?
Right.
Um, and then some people have skills that you know really lend themselves to leadership, but maybe they're at a job where there's no opportunity to step into leadership. Maybe you can't be charge nurse, or maybe there's no way to advance from clinical nurse 1 to clinical nurse 2 and 3, like up the clinical ladder. So, when people they want to advance, or they want to change, or they want something to transition into, what do you advise? Like you mentioned you go to your supervisor or your boss or your manager and ask about opportunity, right? I would like to do this, or I'd like more of this. But if you're in a place, a, a workplace where that just doesn't feel possible, like there's just
Mhm.
not much lateral or any vertical space to move at all, then how do you make the choice that, okay, it's time to go, and how do you know where to go next other than like looking at job boards? Like, what do you advise people to do?
It's easy to think like, oh, I'll just leave this job and apply to a leadership job, and
Yeah,
that's what I think I want to do, right?
right, right.
And a leadership job, like a job posting, is the packaging. It's the packaging of the things that you may or may not want to do. And taking that time to do that assessment, why am I interested in moving into leadership? What is it about that that interests me? Because I think our profession sometimes does a disservice to nurses, and we take excellent individual all-star individual contributor nurses, and we say, oh, the next step for you after being a great nurse is to go into management or leadership. And I really disagree with that. I think it's really important. And I think we're doing a better job through like clinical educators and those kinds of roles of creating tracks for people to stay clinical when that's where their interest is and that's where their passion is in the clinical space. So there's opportunity to kind of grow and advance within the clinical space because leadership is a different job. And your nursing knowledge and a lot of your skills will serve you, but it's a different job. So kind of selling it as necessarily a promotion or a step up for a clinical nurse, I think is misleading. And I've worked with a number of clients who have kind of been convinced to go that route into leadership, only to realize I don't like it here. This isn't what I want to do.
Mm-hmm,
I want to be working with patients and families, and then but now they have this title and they have this work, and it's like it feels like a failure to retreat from here, which it's not. It's just you've experimented and you've learned new information, and now you're going to make a different choice based on that information.
mm-hmm,
But so evaluating, why do I want to go into leadership? What's interesting to me about it? What is moving me in that direction? And then again, getting really clear on what does that need to look like for me to be engaging? Because a leadership job is not a standard thing, right? There's so much variation within leadership roles and within organizations. So looking at what we actually want in that space. And I work with people typically to get clear on your non-negotiables. So let's get
mm-hmm,
really clear on your non-negotiables. And sometimes that's on commute, sometimes that's on hours, sometimes that's on pay, sometimes that's on the type of work that they're going to be doing or the number of people that they're going to be supervised. Like there can be any number of things that become the non-negotiables. And then when you start looking at jobs in job boards or postings, or ideally you're networking, right? It's much easier and more effective pathway to be networking your way into new opportunities rather than just applying to posted jobs. But as you're evaluating new opportunities, you can kind of compare that against your non-negotiables. Like, is this actually a thing that's meeting the needs I have? Or does it look pretty and shiny, but it's going to conflict a lot with what I want? So getting that clarity first, and then, yeah, like a job posting is the packaging. It's the packaging of the tasks and the responsibilities and the accountabilities and all of that. And job postings can look really pretty and shiny on the surface. And then we realize, oh, that's not for me, right? Like, and sometimes people realize that kind of too late that
mm-hmm.
that's not for me, and they're already in that position. So certainly, there are many different ways to work towards leadership jobs if that is not available at your organization. But taking the time to do that in a thoughtful way will help to ensure that you have a much better experience. And also, how are they going to support a new leader? If you're new to leadership, what does this organization do to help support new leaders? Because I think I, I see coaching and training and resources like that provided often at like the director and above level of leadership. But for new leaders, it's like, here's how you approve time cards and do the schedules. Good luck. And now you're facing a huge number of challenges without adequate like support and mentorship to navigate that successfully. So so yeah, what does that support mechanism look like is also super important to evaluate.
So true. Right. And just because someone is a really good clinician doesn't mean they're going to make a good leader and doesn't mean they want to be one, but I have seen people convinced to take leadership positions because they're a great clinician.
Yeah,
And then,
me
but,
too.
and they do many people in that position do get sort of thrown to the wolves. It's like, you're right. Here's how you onboard people. Here's how you do this. Here's how you do the schedule. And you're right. Good luck. Right.
Mhm.
And, you know, mentoring's great when you have a mentor. And it's a rare organization, I think, that has a formal mentoring program where people get paired, and there's like a formal relationship in terms of mentoring. So sometimes I think it's most efficacious just to find somebody yourself. And just like you mentioned in the first half, how you're on LinkedIn, you find somebody who does something cool, you reach out to them and ask if you can have a 20-minute conversation so you can ask them about what they do. That's a risk, right? There's a relative risk in doing that. But asking someone to be your mentor, like someone to really give of their time for you when it's not a formal relationship condoned by your workplace, that's a hard thing. But just like I mentioned, how the apprenticeship kind of paradigm is very old and doesn't happen much in our culture anymore, mentoring doesn't often happen either. And we can make it happen. And many people are happy to be mentors. I've done it myself and I've had mentors. So do you find that some people have success in kind of entering into mentoring relationships that help them either with a transition or learning what they need to do or what's next? Is that something you think happens, or should it be happening more in many people's lives and careers?
I think it should be happening more, but I
Okay.
agree with you that a lot of other leaders are strapped for time and attention too.
Mm-hmm.
And within an organization, especially if you're looking to have mentorship from your boss or someone in, directly above you, they have a vested interest in you doing certain things, right? And that's not bad. That's the nature of they have to, also be looking at the best interests of the organization. So it is where I think where coaching can play a big role, someone who's completely there to support you and it does not have a vested interest in the outcome in terms of the organization. Um, but I think a way, if you can find someone else, maybe someone you've admired, if it is within your own organization, someone whose leadership style you've admired, that's an excellent opportunity to ask for that type of a relationship and to be prepared when you ask for that type of relationship. What are you wanting to get out of it? What is the, you don't just want to take up an hour of their time meeting every week or every other week or whatever, but what are you trying to accomplish within that time? So kind of getting clear on that, doing your own professional development. If you're going to step into leadership, you better start reading, listening to podcasts, learning, right? Because you've got to do your own professional development. Um, but there's also value to be found in looking at people around you in the workplaces that you're in, where you admire parts of how they operate and how can you maybe get some mentorship or some support because this person does this thing really well. Like you've noticed this person's really good at having hard conversations. So how might you ask them for some support in that, right? So you're not asking for a broader, huge mentorship commitment where they have to meet with you all the time, but how might you get support in that? Or you've noticed that someone else just seems to be really good at staying calm when things get kind of wild. So how might you talk with them about their strategies or resources they use for that? So I think there's an opportunity to get mentorship in little pieces too,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't have to come from one person. And choose I tell new nurses this when they're entering the hospital, like choose to learn from people you want to be like, not necessarily people you want to be friends with.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are a lot of people we want to be friends with. We like them, they're cool people, but maybe they don't have the best habits or the best communication styles or whatever. So when you're looking to develop professionally, look for people who are modeling the skills and behaviors you want to develop and go to them, even if they're not the person you would hang out with, after work. So who do you want to be like?
That's really good. That's really good advice. Sort of like, who do you want to be when you grow up, in a sense? And yeah, there are people you want to emulate. You don't necessarily want to be friends with them, right? But there's something about how they move in the world that you're like, wow, you're just like, either in awe or just really impressed by how they do that thing. And I just had this idea when you were talking about, you get this little thing from each person. It was like micro mentoring. Like you
Hmm.
get mentored on just this one little piece. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you lead meetings? I want to see, how do you go about it? Like, how do you make meetings so effective, right? And then you go to the next person. It's like, how do you do X, Y, or Z? I really like that whole idea of what maybe I just coined a term of micro mentoring.
Might. I'll have to
Um,
Google it.
yeah. Um, you know, how do you get all of those little pieces from different people and fit them into the puzzle of who you are and who you want to be? And so we've touched on mentoring. We've talked about the transition into leadership and why or why not we might do that. You seem to focus a lot, like I do, actually, on values. Like if things are not in your work are not aligned with your core values, it's going to feel off no matter what you do. And we also talked about ways in which, for some of us, a job and career is like everything. That's like, it's just the way that we define our entire life. And for other people, it's like, it's a job, and they're most focused on being a parent or a grandparent or whatever it is they happen to do out in their life. Or maybe they're a quilter and like, that's what they do. Like, that's where their heart lies. So, yeah, I think it's important for some people. Career is the be all and end all. And for other people, it's just what they do. And it's how they bring home a paycheck. And I think there's room for everything and everybody. And, you know, if people want to meet with you, I think you have so much to offer. And I know people can go to KarenSteinbock.com, and it's STEINBOCK. And people can find you on LinkedIn and reach out to you, of course. And I want people to go to the show notes and download your career transition freebie, which I think is a really great worksheet that people can download. And before we go into this last segment, I just want to ask you, is there any other, like, one pearl or one thing that you find is another place where it's helpful to question? You talked about values, you talked about, getting that right fit and finding people to talk to. Is there anything else, like one other thing you feel like is core to the directions in which you steer people when you work with them?
I think there's some power in recognizing that like none of this is really right or wrong, right? There's
Mm,
no one path
yeah.
that's the right path that you have to take. And it's recognizing your own needs and your own willingness to kind of experiment and try things and be in discomfort. So sometimes uh, when I work with people who are in a distressed place in their job, when you're in a place of distress, like everything, when you're drowning, everything looks like a life raft, right? So,
Mm,
so
mm-hmm,
really knowing that you will benefit when you can, when you're not in extreme distress, of course, but when you have the space to slow down, think about what you want, and make a conscious choice. And then I think people are sometimes scared to try something new because there's a lot of talk about this idea of imposter syndrome of like, oh, well, I don't know enough about that, and I can't move into that because,
mm-hmm,
I, I just don't wouldn't know where to begin or I wouldn't know what to do. And I think there's this belief like, oh, for me to do that, I would have to really be someone that I'm not. I would really have to work hard and be someone that I'm not. And I'm not talking about a lack of alignment with your values here. I'm talking about something that feels right and good to you, but is scary and intimidating because you don't know how to do it. And what I have seen over and over again with people is that it's not that we have to become someone we're not to take on a new challenge. It's just that we need to be like a slightly braver version of ourselves.
mm.
And just finding that little bit of courage often gets us through that and into a space where we can really open our minds and learn and grow into new opportunities.
That's great. I really like that. I'm so glad I asked that question because that was brilliant. So I'm gonna have to go back and listen to that again. But yeah, that's so important. And gosh, there's so much more we could talk about, but we do have to wind down. So I have
Sure.
4 quick questions I ask all my guests at the end of each show. Are you game for a quick little lightning round?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question is just around how do you define success? Like what does it mean to you? What does it look like?
Yeah, in Susan Scott's book, Fierce Conversations, there's a line where she writes, I am successful to the degree that who I am and what I live are in alignment. And I don't think I've ever heard something that resonated as deeply with me about
Mm-hmm.
success. I am successful to the degree that who I am and what I live are in alignment. So for me, in my definition of success, that is the thing that deeply resonates.
I,
I
I,
want to be, we've talked a lot about alignment today, hopefully not too
yeah,
repetitively, but it's so core for me in being in a life that feels fulfilling and successful.
I'm not surprised that that's the direction you took that answer. Um, okay, the second question is, we were talking about mentors and, mentorship, but this doesn't have to be a mentor. But is there somebody in your life who has really inspired you or is like a touchstone for you? It could be a living or dead person. It could be a really famous person who has meaning for you, or it could be someone from your personal life who's like one of those people, one of those special people that just like close to your heart.
As I imagine a lot of people answer to this, I've had just so many wonderful
Mm-hmm.
people in my world
Mm-hmm.
and just so many mentors and I guess micro mentors, it would
Mm-hmm.
say, and just supportive, people who've been on my side and on my team throughout my life and career. But I guess for the purpose of this, I'll share, I guess, a kind of a more famous person resource because that might be more useful to anyone who's listening to this podcast. And that is a number of years ago, I was exposed to a book called The 4 Hour Work Week by Tim
Oh
Ferriss.
yeah. Uh-huh.
And it's been so many years. I should probably revisit that book. I haven't. So, I don't. But I know that at the time, that book really helped transform my thinking about what work had to look like, or my belief systems maybe about what the structure of work had to look like, and how it had to be. Having kind of grown up in a more traditional setting where my parents worked like regular jobs for long periods of time, and it all
Mm,
seemed very structured. And it wasn't ever that I had the desire to work only 4 hours a week. I mean, I guess if we could get away from it with it, that'd be great. But it
sure.
was more about reframing my beliefs around what work had to be and how it had to look in the way that our world is now. And that has really inspired me over, I've had a couple periods in my career where I've taken a year off from work to explore and play and think about what's next. And I recognize that comes from like an incredibly privileged position of being able to do that. But I also made choices to help set that up to work. And but yeah, I think this idea of kind of reframing how we look at work and staying with Tim Ferriss just as an influential person, his podcasts of kind of constantly interviewing high performing people, it's like reading a whole bunch of little mini autobiographies, right? And you really start to get a sense of the mindset of different individuals in and who are finding success in their respective areas of focus. And so I think Tim Ferriss's work, at least early on, I'm not currently engaged with a lot of
Mm-hmm.
his work, but that work early on, I think was really influential for me in reframing how I looked at work and how I looked at what kind of mindset it takes to find success.
Cool. In a way, you answered the next question already,
But I have
which,
another one.
yeah. Well, the next question is generally about a book or a movie or something from the wider culture. It doesn't have to
Sure.
be like a favorite, but that is one that you keep going back to, like one of those touchstones for you. It could just be something fun, anything that just is like just one of those things you find you just keep going back to because it it brings something to you over and over.
Sure. I would say that is definitely Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Huh.
this idea that we are creative beings and that a creative life is a more interesting and well-lived life.
Hmm.
I like that idea that we're not here to just work our time away, right? We're here to be creative and have some fun in the world. I
Mm.
think we can have lightness. She talks a lot also about inspiration, kind of having this inspiration and ideas kind of being these things that are looking for humans to collaborate with. And so sometimes they come to us, we get an idea, we get some inspiration to do something, and they hang out with us for a while. But if we don't do something, if we don't take action, they're going to go find another human to collaborate with. And I love thinking about it that way because then when I get an idea or I'm feeling inspired, it helps motivate me to take some action on that. Because I'm like, oh, if I don't do this, it's going to go find a different person to be with. And there's just a lot of like playfulness and joy in that book about how we can approach the things that we do. And
Mm.
yeah, so I would strongly recommend.
Nice. Big Magic, Elizabeth Gilbert. And then you mentioned Tim Ferriss for the other question. So those are good ones. So thank you. That's great.
Yeah,
And I like that idea that ideas are wandering around looking for their people.
I
I
like
like
that
that's a
too.
good reframe. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So last question. If you were named queen of the world tomorrow and you had absolute power, so you could do everything you ever wanted to do, what would be your first act? The first thing you would want to do out of the box to improve the lives of your subjects?
Uh, can they be magical powers?
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. We'll do some big magic then.
Okay.
If I was queen of the world, I think I would replace cruelty and greed with curiosity and compassion.
Mm,
And I know you know, it, look, it's easy to say, oh, I would want no one to be hungry and I would want people to have fair and equitable health care. And those are amazing things. But the
yeah.
fact that we don't have those are rooted in cruelty and greed. Like we live in a
Mm,
world of abundance. We live in a world where there is enough for everyone, and yet we make choices. We make choices to not make that the reality. And so I think, the symptoms that we see of the hardships in the world that so many people are encountering are really just symptoms of underlying cruelty and greed in many ways. And if we could replace that with the curiosity and compassion, people wanting to learn more, people wanting to understand better other people's
mhm.
experiences and perspectives, and then that compassion for what others, for ourselves, for one thing. I think a lack of self-compassion is creating plenty of turmoil in our world, but for ourselves and for others, and to really approach the world from curiosity and compassion would fundamentally change the way that our world looks and operates.
Wow. Well, I would give you the magic scepter hands down. So, Karen, this is so awesome. You and I met on LinkedIn just by serendipity, if one believes in that. And, I think you're amazing. And I'm so happy to have you here right on the cusp of my 500th episode. Like, I just feel like it's just the
Congratulations.
thank you, but I think it's the perfect moment for you and I to talk. And I really, really, really want people to go to KarenSteinbock.com. I want them to check you out on Instagram and connect with you on LinkedIn. And like I mentioned in the show notes, we'll have a link to that freebie that helps people kind of look at their values in transition and career and life. So I really want people to check that out. And I think you're doing great work in the world. And I love the mix of, you know, kind of like the way you look at the world in this sort of magical, way that you were just talking about, plus the grounded part of, careers and career transitions. So I think you bring this lovely, just this lovely amalgam of all that into one place. And I think you're doing just what you're doing is really important. And having your voice on this show is really, I think, just perfect timing. So thank you for taking the time. This has been really great.
Thank you for having me here, and such a delight to have gotten to meet you and to get to speak with you. And congratulations on 500 episodes. Gosh, that level of consistency and effort that it takes to reach that accomplishment is it's certainly something to model in terms of, or certainly something for us to look at in terms of how would we achieve big things when we just stay consistent and we keep putting in the work. And I think about all the cool people you've gotten to meet and all the people who've been fortunate to meet you along the way. What a neat journey.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. And there you have it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Nurse Keith Show. Remember, the show notes are at nursekeith.com. And then on the app where you happen to find yourself listening, please go to karensteinbock.com, download that freebie from the show notes that I mentioned to you. And if you reach out to Karen on Instagram or LinkedIn or through her website, tell her you heard about her here on the Nurse Keith Show. And we are proud members of the Health Podcast Network at healthpodcastnetwork.com. A big shout out to them. And we are adroitly produced by the amazing and wonderful Rob Johnston of 520R Podcasting. And before we say goodbye, I'll leave you with this quote by Maya Angelou. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Be well, dig deep, seek joy, keep in touch. This is Nurse Keith saying adios till next time from beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Karen Steinbock bidding you arrivederci from
Snowy Southern Oregon.
All right. Thank you to Karen. Thanks to everyone for listening. And we will catch you, of course, on the proverbial flip side.